April 15th, 1912. The North Atlantic is pitch black at 41 degrees north latitude. It is 1:50 a.m., and the ocean churns at a lethal -2 degrees Celsius. In these freezing waters, a human heart will cease to beat in roughly 15 minutes. However, this narrative does not commence with architectural diagrams or financial ledgers. It begins right here, on the sharply tilting deck of the Titanic, amidst the screech of buckling steel and the desperate cries of 1,500 souls facing their end. At the center of this pandemonium, near lifeboat number 8, stands an elderly couple. They are Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's, the largest department store in the world, and his wife, Ida. They are among the wealthiest passengers aboard. In modern terms, their fortune would number in the billions. They possess the kind of power, connections, and status that could, in theory, secure a seat to safety. The officer supervising the evacuation recognizes the retail magnate. Breaking the strict protocol of women and children only, he offers Isidor a place in the boat. This becomes the defining moment of a lifetime. Isidor looks at the officer, then glances at the terrified crowd of women remaining behind. He steps back, uttering the words that witnesses would later immortalize. "I will not go before other men." Ida Straus, who has already stepped onto the wooden floorboards of the lifeboat, witnesses this. She has been married to Isidor for 41 years, and she understands his resolve perfectly. Slowly, she rises and steps back on to the sinking ship. The officers, horrified, attempt to stop her, while Colonel Archibald Gracie begs her to save herself. Ida simply replies with words that will be splashed across New York newspapers days later. "We have lived so many years together. Where you go, I go." In this final interval, a gesture occurs that will decide the fate of their legacy. Ida removes her full-length mink coat and hands it to her maid, Ellen Bird, who is already seated in the boat. "Take this," Ida insists. "You will need it, but I won't anymore." Lifeboat number 8 lowers into the obsidian water. Ellen Bird survives to recount this tragedy. Isidor and Ida remain on the deck. The last glimpse anyone has of them, they are sitting on deck chairs, holding hands. 20 minutes later, a wave sweeps them away. Isidor's body is eventually recovered and returned to New York for internment at Woodlawn Cemetery. The ocean, however, never returns Ida. The following day, headlines scream of the catastrophe. Macy's stock fluctuates wildly. The commercial empire has lost its head. Yet, in the shadow of this global disaster, a quieter but equally dramatic narrative begins to take shape. It is a story about what becomes of ambition and wealth when their owners vanish into the abyss. The scene shifts 18 years into the future. It is 1930 in Middletown, New Jersey. A massive construction site dominates the landscape. Amidst the mud and scaffolding, Isidor's son, Herbert Nathan Straus, begins to erect a structure designed to challenge death itself. He becomes obsessed with creating a home that, unlike the Titanic, will never disappear. A fortress of stone imported from Europe, meant to serve as a sanctuary for the Straus dynasty. This estate is to be named Cobble Close Farm. If you examine photographs of the site today, you will see a majestic French Norman castle. You will see steep roofs clad in red tiles, painstakingly dismantled from ancient French homes and shipped across the Atlantic. You will see massive walls, classical statues, fountains, and colonnades. It resembles a monarch's residence. But there is a cruel irony here that tourist brochures often omit. What stands today, what architects and realtors admire, is not a mansion. It is not a palace. These are merely the outbuildings. These are the cowsheds, the stables, and the garages. Herbert Straus conceived a project of such colossal scale that these magnificent structures were intended only for servants and livestock. The actual main house
was designed to sit atop the hill, towering over this splendor. But the main house was never built. Fate played the same cruel trick on the son as it did on the father. The Great Depression, coupled with the sudden death of Herbert Straus, halted construction forever. The heir's ambition collided with reality, and reality won. Today, we visit Middletown to explore this architectural ghost. We walk through corridors that resemble royal chambers, yet were constructed for prize-winning cattle. We disassemble brick by brick the rise and fall of one of America's most influential families. This is not merely a tale of the wealthy. It is a story about the attempt to purchase immortality, an attempt to build a wall between oneself and the chaos of the world that, one night in April 1912, claimed Herbert's parents.
Welcome to Cobble Close Farm, a monument to an unfulfilled dream. To truly understand why, decades later, an architectural anomaly worth millions would rise from the New Jersey fields, we must rewind time further. We must move from the icy waters of 1912 to the humid, dusty roads of Georgia in the mid-19th century. The history of the Straus family is not a fairy tale of sudden fortune. It is a chronicle of survival built upon ashes. The family patriarch, Lazarus Straus, Isidor's father, arrived in the United States in 1852. He fled Bavaria not for a better life, but to escape the aftermath of a failed revolution. The family settled in the South, in the town of Talbotton, starting from nothing by trading hardware and farm implements. Isidor, the future magnate, did not wear silk suits in his youth. He worked behind a counter, scrutinizing every cent that passed through his fingers. Then came the Civil War. The conflict decimated the Southern economy and wiped the Straus family's first business off the face of the earth. They lost almost everything. In 1865, as the smoke of battle cleared, the family faced a stark choice: accept poverty or risk the little that remained. Isidor Straus, having just turned 20, made the decision that would define the dynasty's DNA. He convinced his family to move to New York, the beating heart of the financial beast. The Trojan horse of 14th Street. New York City in the late 1860s was a brutal landscape, a metropolis defined by robber barons, the political corruption of Tammany Hall, and staggering inequality. Into this volatile environment entered the Straus family. Rather than attempting to dominate the market immediately, they employed a strategy reminiscent of a Trojan horse. In 1874, Isidor and his brother Nathan executed a business maneuver that would eventually be studied as a masterclass in negotiation. They struck a deal with Roland Hussey Macy, the founder of the department store on 14th Street. The Strauses did not initially buy the store, nor did they possess the capital for such an acquisition. Instead, they rented only the basement. In this dimly lit, low-ceilinged space, they opened a concession selling porcelain and glassware under the signage of L. Straus & Sons. To the casual observer, this might have seemed a humble, perhaps even humiliating position for ambitious men. However, Isidor possessed a keen understanding of consumer psychology that his peers lacked. At that time, porcelain was a status symbol reserved exclusively for the elite. The Straus brothers shattered this paradigm. By establishing direct supply lines from Europe and bypassing intermediaries, they were able to offer luxury goods to the middle class. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The basement concession soon began generating more profit than the entirety of Mr. Macy's operations above ground. The philosophy of trust and cash. It was within these walls that Isidor Straus forged the rigid business philosophy that his son Herbert would eventually inherit. It was a doctrine built on two pillars: trust and cash. In an era when retailers lured customers into debt through credit schemes, Macy's, under the Strauses, operated strictly on a cash basis. While this appeared to be commercial suicide, it proved to be a stroke of genius. It allowed them to undercut every competitor on price. To further secure their margins, they popularized the odd pricing system, the psychological trick of pricing items at 99 cents. This was not merely for marketing, it forced cashiers to open the register to make change, thereby creating a transaction record that prevented employee theft. By 1896, the tenant became the landlord. Isidor and Nathan Straus purchased Macy's outright, transforming from basement renters into the sole owners of the largest retail enterprise on the planet.
The invisible wall. Despite the facade of monumental success, a deep social conflict simmered beneath the surface. Isidor Straus was undeniably wealthy, a philanthropist, a U.S. congressman, and an advisor to presidents. Yet, in the Gilded Age of New York, an invisible barrier remained. Families of old money, such as the Astors and Vanderbilts, viewed merchant upstarts, particularly those of Jewish descent, with suspicion. The Strauses were respected for their integrity and their fortune, but the doors to Manhattan's most elite social clubs often remained locked against them. This experience of being an outsider at the pinnacle of society deeply impacted the consciousness of the next generation. Enter Herbert Nathan Straus. Born in 1881, Herbert came of age in a reality vastly different from his father's. He never knew the hunger of Georgia or the dust of country roads. He walked on marble floors and graduated from Harvard University in 1903. Refined, educated, and erudite, Herbert was the third son, a precarious position in a classic dynasty. He was close enough to power to be burned by ambition, yet often too far from the throne to wield it. However, Herbert possessed a unique combination of traits, the soul of an aesthete and the grip of a bulldog. While Isidor had built a business to survive, Herbert sought the legitimization of greatness. He intended to prove that the Straus family were not merely merchants, but America's new aristocracy. The burden of legacy. Herbert observed his father's management style closely. Isidor was a man of ironclad principles, best illustrated by a historical fact from the financial panic of 1893. As banks collapsed in domino fashion, Isidor ordered employee salaries to be paid in gold and silver to bolster confidence, depleting the company's reserves to protect his workforce. Herbert absorbed this lesson. Money is merely a tool. Reputation and legacy are paramount.
But in 1912, the foundation of Herbert's world was obliterated. The loss of his parents on the Titanic was more than a personal tragedy. It was an abrupt transfer of power. Herbert and his brothers, Jesse and Percy, suddenly found themselves steering the massive Macy's machine. The world anticipated failure, expecting the empire to crumble without Isidor's genius. Instead, Herbert Straus was ready. He craved action. The Fortress of Middletown. As America entered the Roaring '20s, an era of jazz and prohibition, a grand design took shape in Herbert's mind. He wished to construct an estate that would eclipse the mansions of old money, a private world where he alone set the rules. Rejecting Fifth Avenue and its entrenched snobbery, he looked across the Hudson River to the hills of New Jersey. Middletown became the stage for his spectacle. Herbert decided his home would not be American. He rejected colonial styles and Victorian opulence, turning instead to Europe, the land of his ancestors and the site of his parents' demise. He chose the French Norman style, heavy, stony, and eternal. This was not merely an aesthetic choice, it was psychological armor. Norman castles were fortresses designed to withstand sieges. Following the sinking of the Titanic, a symbol of technology's frailty against nature, Herbert subconsciously sought a structure that could not be sunk. Collaborating with architect Alfred Hopkins, a master of detail, he developed a plan that surpassed any private construction of the time. Yet the project contained a fatal flaw that would turn Cobble Close Farm into an architectural paradox.
Herbert, a perfectionist, decided to begin construction not with the main residence, but with the service buildings and the farm. The logic was strategically sound. Create the infrastructure, refine the style on smaller forms, house the staff, and then erect the crown jewel. It was the approach of a businessman used to building from the basement up, but he was unaware that he was running out of time. While he approved blueprints for cow barns that resembled cathedrals, the clock was ticking.
A union of dynasties. To understand the magnitude of this ambition, one must look back to 1907. An event described in newspaper society columns as a wedding was in reality a merger of capital comparable to a military alliance. Herbert Nathan Straus married Therese Kuhn. This union joined two of the most powerful Jewish dynasties in America. On one side stood the Strauses, the kings of retail. On the other was the Kuhn family, founders of Kuhn, Leb & Co., the second most influential investment bank in the United States, rivaled only by the Morgan Empire. This marriage elevated Herbert's status permanently. He was no longer just the son of a rich merchant. Through Therese, he accessed the highest echelons of the financial aristocracy. It was an alliance of new money, earned from goods, and old money, earned from managing global gold flows. Together, Herbert and Therese formed a tandem that by the 1920s sought to materialize their immense influence. An apartment on Park Avenue was insufficient. A country club was not enough. They required a kingdom. As the stock market climbed vertically, multiplying their fortune, Herbert evolved from an heir into a visionary. While he managed finances at Macy's, his soul demanded creation. This union of pragmatic retail and elite banking gave birth to the concept of Cobble Close Farm. Avoiding the fashionable Newport of the Vanderbilts, they purchased hundreds of acres of forest and fields in Middletown to begin their transformation into gentleman farmers. The pastoral utopia. At that time, gentleman farming was a fashionable diversion for the super-rich, but Herbert Straus took this hobby to its absolute extreme. He did not merely wish to breed cattle, he intended to engineer a flawless pastoral utopia. To realize this vision, he commissioned Alfred Hopkins, a figure who was as much an ideologue as he was an architect. Hopkins was the author of Modern Farm Buildings, a text that preached a revolutionary concept. A cowshed should possess the beauty of a palace, and a barn should inspire aesthetic awe. This collaboration between an architect fanatic and a client with unlimited resources ignited a singular construction process. Their strategy was deceptively simple: create the total illusion that this estate had stood on American soil for 3 or 4 centuries. Straus and Hopkins rejected anything contemporary. They turned their backs on the Art Deco style then conquering New York City, looking instead to Normandy. The social impact was immediate. Neighbors and the press buzzed about the Straus Castle, unaware they were admiring a garage and a barn. This optical illusion was the result of Hopkins's genius and Herbert's ambition. At 47, Herbert Straus was at the zenith of his power, a father of 3, a titan of industry, and a man building his own Versailles. He had overcome his ancestors' poverty and survived the trauma of his parents' death. He felt invincible, failing to notice the economic storm clouds gathering on the horizon. October 1929 was approaching, but for now, only the ring of hammers on stone broke the silence in Middletown. The psychological fortress. Standing before the massive wrought iron gates of Cobble Close Farm today, one's mind is easily deceived. It appears to be an ancestral French nest transported by magic to New Jersey. But this is not just a building. It is a psychological imprint of Herbert Straus's consciousness, an architecture of trauma and power. The complex is defined by its enclosure. Unlike the open American home with its welcoming lawn, this is a fortress. The buildings form a quadrangle, a closed courtyard shielded from the outside world by high walls and towers. After the Titanic and the memory of cold, boundless water, Herbert Straus built the antipode of the ocean. He created a space where every centimeter was under control. These walls offer the embrace he lost in 1912. Approaching the masonry, one sees stucco, a plaster mixed with stone chips. But look closer. The stones are laid to suggest they have survived centuries. Some protrude, others recede. Hopkins and Straus achieved a manufactured patina, artificially aging the building as it was raised. They invented a history that did not exist. The illusion of age. The roof reveals the height of this perfectionism. The red terracotta tiles are laid unevenly in chaotic waves. This was intentional. Workers were instructed to mimic the sagging of a medieval roof settling over centuries. Straus spent a fortune to ensure a brand new roof looked as though it might leak from old age. For him, old meant reliable. New was fragile, like the Titanic. Passing through the archway into the inner courtyard, the sound of footsteps changes on the cobblestones, becoming heavy and echoing. To the left lies the dairy wing, to the right, the stables, in the center, staff quarters. Entering what were once barns, now converted into living spaces, the skeleton of the structure remains visible. The ceiling features massive oak beams, roughly hewn with an axe, dark as if smoked by hearths for 300 years. The walls are paneled in wormy chestnut, a wood prized in the 1920s for its texture. The small beetle holes created a pattern of decay that Herbert adored. The air itself smells of old wood, cold stone, and wax. In the stable wing, the windows are not simple glass, but leaded transoms, narrow and tall. When the sun strikes them, the room resembles a Gothic cathedral rather than a stable. The floor is laid with metlac tiles, meaning Straus's cows walked on surfaces more expensive than the parquet floors of most New York apartments. This luxury for animals screams of paradox, but the answer lies in the psychology of new money striving to become old. In Europe, aristocrats had lived alongside their horses for centuries. Herbert Straus was simply ensuring his dynasty looked the part. The sacred mundane. Herbert Straus did not just adopt the lifestyle of a gentleman farmer, he pushed it to a grotesque level of perfection. He sought to sanctify the mundane, desiring that even the removal of manure take place within an atmosphere of grandeur. This was an attempt to elevate daily existence. If his cattle resided in a palace, what did that make him? He became the deity of this microcosm. In the gardens, statues of Greek and Roman gods stand frozen in dance among the manicured topiary. These are not mere decorations, they are assertions of legitimacy. Straus, a second-generation merchant, surrounded himself with the symbols of ancient European power, appropriating a history not his own. These marble guardians signaled to every guest, "We are here forever. We are as ancient as this stone." Particular attention was lavished on the orangery, a long gallery featuring floor-to-ceiling arched windows. Designed to house exotic plants during winter, the floor was laid with heat-retaining stone. Walking through this space, the acoustics shift dramatically. One transitions from the intimate wood-paneled depths of the interior into a realm of light and echoes, a move from privacy to publicity. Here, Herbert intended to stroll, imagining himself the lord of a provincial estate. Every detail in the house was subject to scrutiny. Herbert and Therese personally selected or approved every door handle and hinge. Blacksmiths hand-forged ironwork to mimic medieval craftsmanship. The fireplaces are vast enough to stand in, built of dressed limestone. When lit, the firelight animates the shadows on the walls, breathing life into the cold stone. The palace for servants. Yet the most defining feature of this estate is what is missing. As one walks through these magnificent halls, a singular thought persists. This was built for the help. The scale of ambition required to construct a building worthy of kings for chauffeurs and grooms is dizzying.
It creates a profound sense of absence. If this is merely the service wing, what would the main residence have been? The primary house was intended to crown the hill further up the slope. An alley leads there, now terminating in emptiness. Architectural plans depicted a structure of even greater grandeur, featuring taller towers and a ballroom capable of holding hundreds. Cobble Close Farm is effectively an architectural prologue to an unwritten novel. We are walking through a draft that turned out to be a masterpiece.
Despite the beauty, a palpable loneliness permeates the stone. The narrow, loophole windows offer security but also isolation. Herbert Straus was building a refuge, a sanctuary walled off from the world's chaos by half-meter-thick masonry. The stage was set, the lighting arranged, and the decor built with manic precision. The actors, the Straus family, were poised to perform the eternal life of American aristocracy. But reality rewrote the script. Just as masons were placing the final tiles on the cow barn roof, brokers on Wall Street were loosening their collars in panic. It was 1929. The economic bubble fueling Herbert's ambitions was about to burst, sending a shockwave that would reach the quiet hills of New Jersey and turn the construction of the century into history's most luxurious, unfinished project. The Feast During the Plague. We step out from the cool halls of Cobble Close into the harsh light of history. While craftsmen in Middletown polished oak panels in a barn costing more than a Bronx City block, Manhattan descended into hell. On October 24th, Black Thursday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average began its freefall. Herbert Nathan Straus stood in the eye of the hurricane. As the treasurer of Macy's, he was the man responsible for money at the very moment money seemed to evaporate. In weeks, American corporate capitalization shrank by $30 billion, more than the U.S. spent on World War I. For the Macy's empire, it was a gut punch. Sales plummeted. Consumers stopped buying porcelain and French gowns, scrounging instead for food. At this juncture, the story of Cobble Close shifts from an architectural chronicle to a moral dilemma. On the hills of New Jersey rose a nearly completed Norman masterpiece, a triumph of art. Beyond its gates, America plunged into the darkness of the Great Depression. Hoovervilles, shantytowns of tin and cardboard sprouted up, and unemployment soared to 25%. People queued for soup, while Herbert Straus built a palace for cows. A deep ambivalence surrounds our hero. On one hand, he provided livelihoods. Hundreds of masons, carpenters, and gardeners were paid precisely because of his obsession. He fed their families. On the other hand, such opulence against a backdrop of national starvation appeared grotesque, a feast during a plague. Herbert felt this tension. He was torn between two worlds. By day, he reviewed loss reports and laid off employees at Herald Square. By night, he studied blueprints for a main house that would cost millions more. The heart of the tragedy. Between 1929 and 1933, the turning point arrived. Herbert decided to freeze the construction of the main house. The foundation, perhaps already marked on the hilltop, remained lines on paper. But Herbert's true tragedy was not financial. The Strauses were too wealthy to go bankrupt. His tragedy was internal. He had shouldered the burden of Isidor's legacy, striving to be worthy of the father lost on the Titanic. He sought to build a fortress to protect his family, but the immense stress of steering a retail giant through the worst economic crisis in history burned him out. His body began to fail. Doctors urged him to stop, to rest, but the perfectionist in him refused. He worked himself to exhaustion, trying to save Macy's and preserve his dream in New Jersey. On April 6, 1933, at the age of 51, Herbert Nathan Straus died. A heart attack struck him in his New York townhouse, instant and merciless. Death overtook him as suddenly as the iceberg had his parents. The difference lay in their final moments. Isidor and Ida died holding hands, accepting the inevitable, while Herbert died consumed by the tension of trying to control an uncontrollable world. The guardian of ruins. His death
changed everything. Cobble Close Farm lost its meaning. Without the visionary, the project became an orphan. Therese Straus was left alone at 49, a widow with 3 children, a sprawling empire, and an unfinished estate.
Here, Therese's role transformed. She ceased to be the muse and became the guardian of ruins. She faced a choice that would define the property forever. She could continue the main house as a memorial, a logical step for a grieving billionaire. But Therese viewed reality with sober eyes. It was 1933. The Depression was raging, her husband was gone, and her children were growing. She had no need for a 100-room palace on a hill, nor for the demonstration of power that had killed her husband. She made a paradoxical but correct decision. She canceled the main house forever. Instead, she took the outbuildings, the luxurious barns and the manager's house, and ordered them converted for family living. It is the ultimate irony. The billionaire owners of Macy's moved into a barn. Of course, it was the most luxurious barn in existence. Alfred Hopkins returned to connect the disparate structures into a single residence. Stalls became libraries, haylofts became bedrooms, staff quarters merged into spacious living rooms. Yet the essence remained. They lived in the shadow of what was supposed to be. Every time Therese stepped into the courtyard, she faced the empty hill where Herbert's castle should have stood. That emptiness screamed louder than any wall. The monument to vulnerability. Cobble Close Farm stands today not as a monument to wealth, but to vulnerability. It is the site where ambition clashed with mortality and lost. In the wake of Herbert's death, neighbors whispered, and society debated the strange choice of the Straus widow. Yet, for Therese, the estate became a refuge. She closed the gates. The high walls Herbert built to protect his dream now served to protect her grief. The moral layer of this story becomes transparent here. Herbert Straus spent years and millions constructing a shell for a life he never lived. He built the perfect scenery, but the lead actor died before opening night. It is a classic tragedy played out against the backdrop of New Jersey. A man attempts to deceive fate with stone, but fate finds a crack in his own heart. The mansion we see today is the result of a compromise with death, a plan B that became a masterpiece born of necessity.
The long postscript. The story did not end in 1933. Rather, it entered a long, painful, yet majestic postscript. Therese Straus, widow of the man who sought to build a Versailles in New Jersey, remained the mistress of this stone labyrinth for decades. She lived within a paradox, inhabiting spaces architecturally designed for elite livestock and servants. Imagine the psychology of such an existence. One eats breakfast in a room blueprints labeled as a milk kitchen. One reads in a hall designed for harness storage. Yet, thanks to Hopkins' genius and Herbert's fortune, these rooms were more luxurious than most American mansions, featuring high ceilings, fireplaces large enough to roast an ox, and French tapestries. Therese transformed the farm into a family sanctuary. But beyond the estate walls, the world changed at terrifying speed. World War II arrived. While Europe burned, estates like Cobble Close became an endangered species. The era of the Great Gatsby died, replaced by pragmatism, high taxes, and social leveling.
The fight against entropy. By the 1940s and 1950s, maintaining such a giant became a logistical nightmare. Built of stone and concrete, the structure devoured tons of coal and oil in winter. Drafts still roamed the corridors, and the gardens required an army of laborers. But the greatest challenge was not money, it was people. The class of professional servants vanished. Young Americans no longer wanted to be footmen living in a rich man's wing. They wanted to work in Ford factories and own suburban homes with white picket fences. Cobble Close was built for a rigid hierarchy, master at the top, servants at the bottom, that no longer existed. The estate transformed from a symbol of ambition to one of preservation. Therese and her heirs no longer sought to impress, they fought to hold back the entropy of time. Therese outlived her husband by many years, watching grandchildren play among the ancient statues. For this new generation, Cobble Close was not a tragedy or an unfinished dream, it was simply Grandma's farm, a magical castle devoid of the pain of loss. A new chapter, the cooperative. By the 1980s, the burden became unsustainable. The heirs faced the classic dilemma of old money, owning a multi-million-dollar asset that devoured hundreds of thousands in maintenance. It was too huge for comfort, too archaic for the computer age, and too far from the city. In 1983, the family sold the estate. Cobble Close ceased to be the private possession of a single dynasty. Unable to be demolished due to its artistic value and unsuitable for offices due to its layout, it underwent a saving transformation. It became an elite residential cooperative. The single organism was divided into separate residences. Irony abounds in this new life. The space intended for pedigree bulls became a living room for a lawyer. The saddle storage room became a stockbroker's bedroom. The caretaker's tower became a fashionable studio. Herbert's feudal dream of one lord, one land was shattered into market-accessible pieces. Yet this division saved the building, bringing in new money and modern energy.
Herbert's spirit persisted. The new owners found that living in Cobble Close meant submitting to the rules of stone. One cannot simply cut a new window into a half-meter-thick wall or replace a 300-year-old oak door with plastic. The house dictated the terms. Herbert's dream of an immortal house came true, but in a perverse way. The house outlasted its creators and forced new people to serve it. The emotion frozen in time. With the sale, the veil of secrecy lifted. Photographers and historians finally saw what had been hidden for half a century, the most luxurious outbuildings in American history. It became clear that Cobble Close is not merely real estate, it is an emotion frozen in time. It is a monument to the fear of death and the desire to leave a mark. Despite the sale, the Straus legacy remains embedded in the walls. One cannot walk on the cobblestones without thinking of the Titanic. One cannot look at the red-tiled roofs without thinking of Herbert, whose heart stopped before he could lay the first stone of his true palace. The final lesson. If you visit Middletown today, you will see luxury cars parked at doors designed for hay carts. People sleep where prize cows were meant to low. Cobble Close Farm lives on, but it is a life after the death of the dream. It is America's greatest monument to incompleteness. The story mirrors the poem Ozymandias, "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair," but with a poignant twist. Herbert Straus left no ruins. He left magnificent scenery for a play that was canceled. He demonstrated the absolute limit of money. You can buy Macy's shares, hire the best architects, and import roofs from France, but you cannot buy time. The paradox is stark. Had Herbert completed the main house, it would likely have been just another forgotten mansion. But because a billionaire family was forced to live in a barn, the place became legendary. Isidor and Ida's death on the Titanic symbolized love and self-sacrifice. Herbert's death and his unfinished farm symbolized the futility of ambition. The parents sank into the ocean. The son died trying to build an unsinkable ship on land. Cobble Close Farm teaches us that true legacy is not what we plan, but what remains despite our plans. Every stone and gargoyle screams a single message: live now. Do not postpone life until the main house is built, because it may never happen. As the sun sets behind the Norman towers of New Jersey, the shadows lengthen, hiding the fact that this is merely a farm. For a moment, the illusion becomes reality. Herbert Nathan Straus never got his palace, but he gave us a story stronger than granite.
a story reminding us that even the richest among us are merely guests in our own castles.